Good morning, everybody. Welcome. You have joined us at another discovery session. In case you didn't know where you were, happy Friday. So we're very pleased to have you here. Many of you probably know my face by now. I'm Alison Mostowich. I'm the Director of Engagement at Efficiency Canada. I am joining you from Calgary, Alberta, home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina Nation, the Stoney Nakoda Nation, the Métis Nation Region 3, and all the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. And I should mention, while we're a remote workplace, Efficiency Canada is actually based at Carleton University in Ottawa, which is located in the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. So before we get started today, just another reminder to everybody who's maybe new to us. Our guest speaker is going to present for about 20 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions. So you'll see a little question and answer box at the bottom of your screen there. Please use that. You can use it throughout the presentation. There's also an upvote function. So if you see a question in there that you wanted to ask, you can click the like button. And the more likes a question gets, the more probability there is that I will answer it or that I will ask it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark. So Mark is with us today from the Electricity Human Resources Council to share the findings of their flagship labor market intelligence study. So Mark, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Allison, thank you so much for having me today. I'm just going to start sharing my screen so everybody can follow along. There we go. Hopefully I shared the right one, Allison. Can you confirm?
Looks amazing. Yep.
Awesome. Thank
We're
you.
ready to go.
So thank you to you and Efficiency Canada for hosting us. So my name is Mark Chepesky. I am Vice President Program Development at Electricity Human Resources Canada, or just EHRC for short. And a couple of weeks ago, we launched our flagship labor market intelligence report that Allison has referenced. So we thought that today would be a great opportunity to speak to you all about the findings of the report and our projections for the next 5 years. Report title, Electricity in Demand, Labor Market Insights to 2023 to 2028. And we have actually done some projections to 2035 and 2050 because we know those are relevant for everybody. So we'll talk a little bit about those today too. And I promise I will try to keep it under 20 minutes, but no guarantees. And lastly, my apologies if my voice sounds a little bit hoarse. I am on the tail end of recovering from a cold. So with that, let's do a quick portrait of the industry. So the sector 5 years ago was about just under 100,000 people. It has grown to 110,000 working in the core generation, transmission, and distribution of electricity across the industry over the course of the past 5 years. To put that in context or perspective, the sector as a workforce has grown at twice the rate of the broader Canadian economy over the last 5 years. So that's a lot. That's a lot of growth for the industry. And if we think about some of the roles that have seen significant growth, some that have been more emergent historically, but in more recent times are certainly taking over. Wind turbine technicians increased by 6.5 times the total number of postings. The solar or PV postings have increased by 3.5 times in the last 5 years. Unfortunately, through this LMI, one of the things we also discovered, and this is not new to us or news, we actually don't know how many people are currently working in those roles because we don't have national occupational classifications for those functions. And so Statistics Canada doesn't actually track the individual jobs. So we know the number of postings, but we don't know the number of people actually working in them. As can be expected, the sector is broken down largely from a workforce perspective in alignment with Canadian population. So 40% in the province of Ontario, 23% in Quebec, 9% in BC, et cetera. So that's not to be unexpected. One of the things that we did find interesting, though, is that outsourcing of work to contractors and consultants has increased from 16% 5 years ago to 35% today. And we have some suspicions as to why that is, but I'll get to that in just a minute. Total employment share in the industry, broken down by different types. So generation obviously makes up a big proportion of where we find our employees, transmission and distribution as well. And then it's broken out into other areas too. So like automation, electrical contractors, direct access or client service focus, consulting advocacy, et cetera, and construction. But the clear majority, generation, transmission, and distribution. When we look at the core occupations of the industry, so when we break out the 110,000 employees that make up the sector, 27% of them are in the skilled trades. So that is still the dominant occupational group in our industry. And on the screen, you can see sort of a listing of a number of those. And then 15% are in the engineering, technician, and technologist roles. So again, very big proportion of the industry. 9% are managers and supervisors. And interestingly, this time around, where we would have historically grouped ICT in with the other occupations, because of the significant growth in that domain and its projected continued significant growth, an additional core occupational group has been added this time around, and that's the information communication technology group. So this is an area that we've seen astronomical growth, and I'll get to that in a bit of in a second. But anything from cybersecurity to data analysis to AI and machine learning, software engineering, et cetera, all of those are occupations in demand right now, and our projections suggest they will continue to be. Then the balance of occupations, 43%, so it's quite high, are in the sort of other occupations. So that's anything from finance to HR to client service and so on and so forth. So that basically sort of makes up the industry, but the core group, so every time I talk about core occupational groups, that's the skilled trades, engineers, technicians, and technologists, managers, supervisors, and ICT. One of the other things we always look at EHRC is the composition of the sector into the equity deserving groups. So women were at 27%. So the number in the middle represents the total workforce representation. And then within that workforce, so the 27%, we looked at where are women working. So that gray number there, that 60%, aligns with other corporate professionals. So we've increased in 5 years 1 percentage point of women's representation in the industry, but mostly that's in the other corporate professionals roles. It's not actually in the core occupational roles, unfortunately. We've seen very little movement there. To put this in context, if we were to continue moving at 1% every 5 years, that it would take 120 years to reach gender parity in Canada's electricity industry. So just food for thought. Indigenous peoples in Canada make up 5% of the industry, which actually aligns with national population level statistics. However, the majority of Indigenous people find themselves in the skilled trades. So we have a lot of work to do to help Indigenous people find pathways into other occupations into our industry. Black and racialized Canadians or groups were also underrepresented here. So 22% of the industry identifies as Black and racialized. However, broader population trends are closer to 30. So we have work to do here for integration of people from these communities. Persons with disabilities has actually backslid a little bit in 5 years. So 5 years ago, we were at 3% representation of people with disabilities in the industry, and now we're at 1%. Now, there could be a couple of reasons for this. COVID is one of them. We know that people with disabilities were disproportionately impacted by COVID. And we also know that people with disabilities tend to underreport to their employer. And so because this is based on Statistics Canada data and employer survey data, there's a possibility that we're underreporting, but either way, there is no way we're reaching population level statistics here. So this is an area of development and growth for us too. Gender diverse people are counted at 2% of the total industry. And then one that is certainly worth watching because of the total percentage of the workforce that falls into this category is international trained workers. So we're at 19% when that should be closer to 30. And we've made a lot of headway specific to engineering technicians and technologists, or just engineers, I should say. However, there's a lot of work still to be done in the other core occupational groups and the corporate service groups to integrating people from foreign countries. As we look at the age distribution, one of the numbers I always sort of focus on is, what percentage of the workforce is over the age of 55? Because that group is the group that's, heading towards retirement, looking to leave. And so if we look at the total sector, about 17% of the industry is about ready to walk out the door, 29% in ICT specifically, and 24% of managers and supervisors are 55 and up. Conversely, the youth side of things, we're only at 5% of the total workforce under the age of 25. Now, the reason that's problematic is we essentially have 3 workers over the age of 55 for every worker under the age of 25. And so we are not looking at a really strong replacement value there. And so it's something that we need to really focus on, is bringing more youth into the industry, regardless of which occupation it is. Of particular concern is ICT, because we've only got about 3% of the workforce is under the age of 25. So something to keep in mind. As we look at where we're getting people from, so where the components of labor supply, there are 2 primary groups. So one is permanent residents or new Canadians or just internationally trained people. Canada has last year, our population grew by almost a million, or it was 1 million people for the first time in Canadian history. 97+% of that was driven by immigration. If we relied solely on domestic supply of talent in our country or of labor in our country, we would actually see population decline. We are simply not having enough babies to replace ourselves. And so immigration is going to be key to longer term economic development as we look to fill open roles. You'll notice the dip in 2020 that was COVID related for the total number of permanent resident admissions into Canada. So that's something worth noting, but you'll notice that it bounced back and in fact went beyond in the following year, and we're projecting that it will continue to increase over the coming years. The other areas that we need to look, of course, from the previous slide are underrepresented groups, those that are currently underrepresented in our industry that we should be doing a better job of engaging with. And then the last group, of course, is school leavers who we've relied on historically. So those people that are leaving the engineering, technician, technologist programs or skilled trades programs in Canada and entering into our industry. So that's where we need to look, and sort of an all hands on deck approach to where we find people. One thing that we really wanted to call out in particular with this study is the apprenticeship registrations and completions. So as you'll sort of note, our apprenticeship registration numbers have been declining year over year. There's been a couple of bumps up, but mostly if you were to draw a line from 2013 to today, the trend is sort of going in the opposite direction. We are getting some preliminary information that may be turning around in the data to come this year, but that hasn't been confirmed yet. However, the trend line has been going in the wrong direction, and I'm going to get to projections as to what we need in the skilled trades, for example, in the coming 5 years. And right now, essentially, our delta between registrations and the number of people we're going to need, the number is getting bigger and bigger year over year. And so we need to improve our attraction of people into the skilled trades. So when we talk about job growth, I mentioned earlier that in our industry over the last 5 years, Canada's total growth has been pretty good. We've been growing. We saw a dip in 2020 and obviously bounced back. The electricity sector, though, has seen twice the growth that the overarching Canadian economy has seen. We were hit by COVID, but not as hard. And the core occupations, in fact, have outpaced the rest of the occupations in the electricity industry. So it's worth noting that this is a sector that tends to be recession-proof, also tends to be partially COVID-proof from a total workforce supply and availability perspective, just because it is an essential service. So where are the occupations? Where are we seeing the growth the most? So we've seen a 1.5 times increase in managers and supervisors, engineers, technicians, and technologists, almost 2.2, trades, 1.1, core occupational groupings, 2.7, but the single biggest area of change has been ICT at 22.2% from 2017 to 2020, the end of 2022 when we looked at the snapshot. That's also not surprising. There's been a lot of adoption of new technology in the industry, a lot of change with regard to technology, a lot of roles that just didn't exist before that have been created in the industry. And we're projecting that will continue. That's not going to change in the foreseeable future. It's also been widespread. So regardless of where you are in the country, growth has been across the board. So whether it's Atlantic Canada, British Columbia, Quebec, Prairies, BC, Ontario even, regardless of where you are, there has been growth, in some cases more than others, but overarching growth across the board with the statistics in front of you. Green bar represents core occupational growth, and the gray bar is total Canadian economy. This is a sector that's got comparably high job quality when compared to other occupations in the Canadian economy. And when we talk about job quality, what we mean is things like turnover rate and wage growth, for example, and just tenure. So our turnover rate historically has been fairly low. These numbers are admittedly a little bit higher over the course of the past 5 years than they have been historically, especially in the renewable energy occupations at 10%. That's quite high. And so it's something to keep an eye on. So still doing fairly well compared to other occupations in the economy, but for the sector, this is higher turnover than we have historically seen. Wage growth has also continued for the sector. So again, this is a fairly well-paid industry. The average employee earns $105,000 per year across all occupations in the industry. And so our wage growth hasn't been quite as good as the broader Canadian economy, but again, they were already in a better place than other areas of the economy. So that's worth noting. And then the other thing I would say too is that there is a high share of permanent employment in this industry versus, permanent full-time employment versus part-time or contract employment. And that's worth noting as well. So let's look ahead. So when we talk about how is the sector feeling about the future, overall, business outlook is very strong to good. Very few people would list it lower than neutral. And so that aligns largely with Canada's net zero ambitions, population growth requiring new build for electricity, infrastructure, et cetera. So this is going to be a sector that is relied on by the Canadian economy for the foreseeable future, particularly as we electrify more and more things. And the single biggest area that executives think is going to be a challenge in the future is going to be finding skilled talent. Inflation, regulatory environment, the usual, supply chain, high interest rates, et cetera. Those were certainly listed, but the finding skilled talent came out on top for sure and was a leading concern. As we project forward, total generation mix and total number of gigawatt hours required for Canada between now and 2050 have been identified here. So 2021 to 2050 and what those different types are with, coal and coke at the bottom, hopefully declining to nothing. Natural gas still there, largely with carbon capture, utilization and storage technology applied. You've got a little bit of oil, obviously, because you've got a number of off-diesel or a number of communities still relying on diesel, et cetera. Uranium represents the nuclear supply mix, hydro, and then biomass, wind, geothermal, solar, et cetera. So as you can see, the graph basically rises pretty quickly between now and 2028 and continues to rise to 2050, which makes sense as we electrify things. And you'll also notice the proportion of solar and wind increases exponentially, but hydro and nuclear continue to make up a pretty significant base load for us as a country. So when we look at our forecast period, we came up with two scenarios. One is what I sort of call the base case scenario. So, policy doesn't really shift, net zero doesn't really happen, and we just sort of continue at our, population level growth change and incremental changes over time. In that scenario, or current measure scenario, we're still projecting growth of the sector. So over time, we'll still see some growth over time. Largely, though, we're going to be driven by replacement demand for total new job openings. In a net zero scenario, however, where policy and industry continue to push towards electrification of things, we're going to see more growth in the industry. And so to give you a sense of what that's going to look like, over the course of the next 5 years, in a current measures scenario, you're looking at about 16,800 new job openings, mostly driven by replacement demand. So the blue bar, the current measures scenario on the right. And in a net zero scenario or path to net zero, you're actually looking at almost twice that because it's not just replacement demand, it's also going to be the new build demand or expansion demand of roles required. Now, as we look at where those roles are going to be, if we look at just to pick on the engineers, technicians, and technologists on the far left, the demand is the shaded bar. So the retirements are going to be about 1,900. The expansion demand is about 1,200. Based on school leavers and job changers, we're going to have about 1,500 people available, which means that we're going to have 1,600 people in that occupational group that we need to find from somewhere that we currently, essentially based on historical data, haven't been finding. So we have to do something about that. Skilled trades, similar scenario. Retirements and expansion on the left with the yellow bar shaded. And then on the right, the current known supply of 5,100 is short by 1,400 people. So we have to figure out how to fill that gap of 1,400 people across the country. ICT is worth calling out because that's the single biggest gap that we have identified, and that's at 3,800 people that we need to find and to fill. And we are already struggling to fill positions in this particular occupational group. And then managers and supervisors. So this is the only area of oversupply. We will actually have more people available to us than demand requires. And so one of the things I've been saying, if you're a manager and supervisor out there, I would dust off my chat GPT skills and bone up on ICT, because that's clearly going to be an area of growth for the future. As we look ahead to 2035 and 2050, this becomes a little bit more like crystal ball gazing, just because the projections are so far forward. So much can change from a policy perspective or even an economic perspective, if there's a downturn or an upturn or whatever it happens to be. However, it's a useful exercise to understand in a current measures versus path to net zero scenario what it might look like from a total workforce perspective. So using data available from us and the latest CER report that looks at what generation technologies might be, et cetera, we've taken a stab at between 2028 and 2035 in a current measure scenario, how many workers might we need? So by 2035, so this is just from 2028 to 2035, so this is tacked on to the workers I was talking about previously. We need an additional 19,000 in a current measure scenario. By 2050, it's going to be 63,000 workers. Mostly those are driven by replacement. In a net zero scenario, though, that's where it gets really interesting. So the current workforce is 110,000 people. We would, in new job openings, would be 130,000 by 2050 if we are on a path to net zero. So essentially, we are looking at creating a whole pile of new workers in this industry, which of course aligns with new build and operation maintenance requirements of a much bigger electricity grid. Just because I'm getting a little short on time, I won't go into too much detail, but EHRC, as part of its report, has put together a series of recommendations that organizations, policymakers can follow as we sort of plan out what the future is going to look like. It's organized into three pillars. The first pillar is attracting and retaining talent. So our biggest issue right now is going to be, things like retaining older workers for as long as we can. We can't rely on that forever, though, so it should all be about knowledge transfer and ensuring that there's succession planning in place. We've got to go beyond promotion to improve gender diversity and work in education. So we've actually got to tackle some of the hard problems that we're facing with regard to sex and gender-based violence and harassment in the industry. Building stronger partnerships with Indigenous people. So Indigenous people is the only domestic population that's growing and in growth mode and has huge untapped potential for our sector, particularly as many people are living in rural and remote communities. And as we all know, electricity is everywhere, so we need people everywhere. We've got to improve our newcomer talent streams that targeted skilled and labor shortages. So where they are, so those occupations that we talked about where we're going to be short, this is an opportunity to stream newcomers in, again, recognizing previous skills and upskilling where required for Canadian context. And then we need to improve our career pathways for all underrepresented groups that are underrepresented in our industry, I should say, and then enhance capacity among education and training institutions to respond to the increased demand that we're going to be placing on them. We also need to continue to safeguard work quality. So even though this is a sector that tends to pay well, has lower turnover, has long tenure, has good full-time and permanent employment, we need to continue to safeguard that because there has been some slippage in the last 5 years. Some of that might be driven by COVID, but only time will tell. So just to make sure that we safeguard that. Improve succession planning processes, enhance foreign credential recognition and assessment, remove barriers to apprenticeship. There are a whole host of them that we could work on. Strengthen collaboration and coordination between educators and employers. I know this has been something we've called for years and continues to be important. Provide new training programs to the sector is going to be critical. And this is particularly true of the renewable energy space, where right now the training ecosystem is all over the map. Fostering continued R&D and innovation. So that is going to, make or break us. There's a lot of proven technology out there, but we have to continue to innovate to solve some of the big problems. And then the last pillar is just about building partnerships. So it sort of takes all of the things that we've previously discussed and recognizes that it is not one organization that's going to solve any of this. We're going to have to work as an industry to solve a lot of the problems that we've talked about. So with that, there is a QR code that you can scan for a link directly to the report, and we will share the slide deck via Allison with all of you to make sure that you have access to it, because that electricity and demand link is actually a link you can click on as well. But with that, I will stop sharing my screen somehow. Let's just see, stop share, so that we can talk about questions. And so, Allison, I don't know if you want to moderate and I can respond.
You bet. Wow, blown away by how much information was in that very short presentation. Thank you so much for bringing that.
I have a ton of questions. Too fast.
I have a ton of questions. I'm sure people in the audience do. So before we get started, once again, I just invite you to place your questions into the Q&A box. And it's funny, as I was writing down questions that I wanted to learn more about. People were sort of asking similar questions in the chat box, so let's get to it. I think first, just because we are Efficiency Canada, I'm curious to know how this information affects the efficiency sector. So when you're talking about jobs in demand, job skills, is there a crossover with the efficiency sector, and sort of generally, where do you see that fit in with energy efficiency?
So I actually see energy efficiency and electricity working hand in hand. This is not, so just before everybody joined, Allison and I were actually having this discussion and how we're at a point, and this is something, again, when you trim a presentation that typically takes an hour down to 20 minutes, it can be, you lose some of the content. And so one of the things that I usually say is that we can't do this with one solution. This is going to be an all hands on deck approach. Energy efficiency is going to be core to helping us get there, because electrification alone is not going to do it. If you put a heat pump in an already leaky home, all you're doing is increasing your electricity demand, but you haven't actually solved the issue of that home not being properly insulated, not having the right windows, and not having the right doors, et cetera, et cetera. So the infrastructure that would be associated with putting heat pumps on 1,000 homes or 10,000 homes or whatever it happens to be, the electricity infrastructure, we can't actually support that with the current grid. So we need both. We need to ensure that homes are upgraded effectively, because if we put the type of heat pump technology on, and I'm just talking home heating right now, but if we put the type of heat pump technology on all homes in Canada to replace natural gas and oil, for example, the electricity grid just couldn't handle it. Not at the pace with which we have to change. If you can downgrade your heat pump to associate with a more energy efficient home, that's more doable. And so they have to work hand in hand, the two sectors, basically,
Right.
as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. And I know most of the provinces are sort of regulated they have demand side management planning. So they actually have to provide some kind of demand side management. And a lot of that comes in the form of efficiency programs from utilities and from the regulators as well. And so that it kind of leads into a second question. And there are some interest in the question and answer boxes about electrification. How is the utility sector looking at electrification? And is that something that these DSM requirements is going to be able to manage? Because I think with the amount of electrification that a lot of people and a lot of organizations are promoting, you kind of said we're not going to be able to meet that, at least in the short term. So do you think that increases the need for efficiency? And how is the sector sort of responding to this electrification challenge right now?
I think so this is where you start to get into a combination of who pays. So is it ratepayers or is it taxpayers? Is policy involved or not? Are we changing regulations or not? The truth is utilities are largely conservative by their very nature. They don't tend to want to do the big build for something that they're not sure is going to come to pass. And rates are suppressed because they're controlled by the energy boards in the different provinces. And so largely we as an industry tend to be fairly conservative with our build outs. That has started to change though. Like in the most recent past, we've started to see, the ISO in Ontario came out with the report, you're going to see brownouts by 2024, basically in Ontario, unless we do something with the electricity grid. Quebec had another one very similar. We're going to see brownouts by 2026, I think, which was news for Quebec because that's not something they had ever predicted before. But if you think it's all being driven by electrification and the projections that are associated with electrification. And a lot of people talk about, okay, well, we need to build new nuclear reactors or new hydro plants or facilities or more wind turbines or more solar. And that's true. A lot of that generation is going to be required, but we also have to build new transmission infrastructure. We also have to upgrade distribution infrastructure because all that extra power needs to have capacity to flow. And the other thing that a lot of folks not in the industry don't talk about is two-way power and the impact that has on the grid. So, Allison, I don't know if you have solar on your roof, but if you did, you want to sell that back potentially to your utility through some sort of a microfit program. That's all managed by the distributor. And that's only possible because the local grid can handle it. Now, the local grid can only handle so much of that right now, though. And the other thing too is if you had an EV and I had an EV and we both lived on the same street, and then our neighbors and our other neighbors also had an EV and they also lived on the same street, odds are we would blow the transformer on the corner if we all plugged in at 5 p.m. when we come home at the end of the day, because the grid's just not ready. It just doesn't have the power flow management system in place yet. There's lots of pilot projects that are happening right now on how to manage this, because it's not just about building for max demand. It's also about supply, like the management, to your point, of power. So I don't know if that's good. I know I've covered a whole bunch of ground here. Did I answer the core question though?
I think so. It's a huge topic. I think we got there.
I mean, the truth is they're going to go hand in glove. Efficiency, like energy efficiency and electrification, they go hand in glove, because we can't just rely on overbuilding our electricity grid and just take for granted the building envelope. Like it can't happen. You cannot build at the rate we need to, because the other thing for the electricity industry, most of those core occupations I talked about, it's 5 years to full competence. So we're already talking about a 5-year projection where we're going to be short of people. So even if we start growing the total, workforce supply today, we're not going to see the benefits of that for 5 years. Yeah. So it's that age-old adage, right? It was best to plant a tree a year ago or 10 years ago, and next best is today, and worst but still good is 10 years from now. Same principle applies in a sector like this, which is highly skilled. And I would say the same is very true of the energy efficiency sector, because again, these are skilled people who need to know what they're doing at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we just see the hope, and we have, I guess, the hope and the expectation that the utility companies will go sort of beyond this DSM regulations, because I don't think the regulations where they are going to get us there in terms of the efficiency that we need to be able to allow this kind of electrification. So it's just interesting that you mentioned sort of the pathway to get to these certain skill sets. And we do have a couple questions about that. So maybe the next question can be about skill sets and coming into the sector. So I think that's pretty much what EHRC is there for, is to help people get into the sector and to learn. So where can people that are interested in coming into this sector that may not have any sort of technical background find resources and find these pathways and these skills needed?
So EHRC has just launched a new website, which I hope is more user navigable than it previously has been. But the idea, there's a few sort of pathways. So obviously, I'm going to promote our website because we've done I think a decent job of highlighting some of the occupations that are possible. I know Efficiency Canada has done a great job with your, I'm just forgetting what it's called. It's the Career Hub. Thank you. That you've done as well. So both of those are good starting points. We actually embarked on a recent initiative as well to engage grades 6 to 8 students. And I know at first blush that may sound a little bit silly, but research suggests that grade 6 to 8 students are starting to stream, whether they're aware of it or not. If they lose interest in science and math in that grade sort of 6 to 8 sort of age range, typically we lose them by grade 10 in high school from our sector. And what I mean by that is, in most provinces, you can actually drop math and science as credits and still get your high school diploma and graduate grade 12 without having done 11 and 12 math and science. If you do that, in most provinces, all the core occupations become inaccessible to you. All core occupations, or almost all of them, require a grade 12 math and science education. And so essentially, if you de-stream from math and science at grade 10, you've just streamed out of our industry. And so one of the messages we're trying to convey to grade 6 to 8 students is that we want you to stick with math and science if you want to be part of the climate change solution, if you want to be part of this industry, basically. And what we've done is we partnered with Canadian Geographic Education, and we've now got this giant floor map. Allison, I don't know if you've seen it, but basically it's 20 by 30 feet. So like feet, that's not an exaggeration. It's 20 by 30 feet. It rolls out across the gymnasium floor, the map of Canada with all of Canada's electricity infrastructure on it, transmission lines, the generation facilities, and it's all like little logos of or not logos, but icons of like windmills and nuclear facilities and hydro dams and that sort of thing. They're all outlined on the map. So kids can walk across and learn. The map has Indigenous treaty languages as well, Indigenous languages, but also treaty territories demarcated on it as well. So people can see and learn about Indigenous communities. And then lastly, they've got little QR codes on it so that you use your phone and walk across, and career profile videos pop up of people who are actually working in the industry talking about their role and why they're passionate about what they do. And the idea is to sort of generate that interest young. We're working on a separate program for high school where high school students can engage in partnership with Electricity Canada, actually, with the energy and electricity system as well. So that's more to come on that down the road. But those are some of the ways that we're trying to create awareness, interest, et cetera, in the industry. And even if you don't have access to the map, all those videos are on our YouTube channel for the career profiles. And there's some really cool ones.
That's fascinating. So I think we've heard today that there are resources for adults through your website, but if you have kids on this call, make sure that they don't drop their math and their science.
Well, it's funny you say that. One of the things, so just given the need over the course of the next 5 years, 2035, 2050, one of the things I've just started saying is bring a friend. Bring a friend to the industry, referrals matter, and help them learn about the sector and why they should join. We need as many people as we can get. Pretty much we're going to be double the size by 2050.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because we see that juxtaposed in some of these skilled trades that we see too, like there's a labor shortage there as well. So yeah, I think just an interesting follow-up question. So are you seeing anything about how non-formal and informal learning could be added to this formal education? So Jonathan was mentioning micro-credentials, programs like Quick Train Canada. How are those sort of impacting the industry right now?
Yeah, it's what I would say about micro-credentials is we really, as a country, need to get our act together and agree on what a micro-credential is. There is a lot of debate about what constitutes a micro-credential in Canada. And so I absolutely think that there is a place for the formal learning, but also the informal learning, and what I would prefer to call continuous learning. And it's largely being driven by the impact of technology. So we have seen the types of technology, this is an industry that has largely been, static's maybe the wrong word, but we've sort of had the same tried, tested, true occupations for decades, that have been in existence. But the technology impacts just from, drone technology, that was a whole game changer for our sector, because now we've got drones flying the lines instead of helicopters with 4 people in them to do the surveying, essentially to understand, what transmission infrastructure needs to be replaced. Well, that led to a whole debate, who's responsible to fly the drone. And I just think it's because everybody wants to fly the drone. But because, this is the engineer, or is it the power line technician who used to fly in the helicopter? Is it the data analyst who actually reviews the images? There was a whole thing. I think they've largely sorted it out now, but for a while it was a big debate who got to fly the drone. Drone technology, smart meters, game changer, just from a power management perspective, because it used to be, remember, you'd have a person would come out and read the meter on your home once a month or a few months, depending on which province you were in. And that's how they sort of planned how much electricity demand was needed. Well, now typical smart meters, you've got 6 readings every few minutes going up to the centralized management systems, right? So all that data needs to be managed. So now you've got data analysts, you've got AI, you've got machine learning. All of this is creating big changes in the sector, often in a good way, but it's creating new roles. It's creating new requirements for skills. And I know it seems like I'm not answering the question, but fundamentally, when you talk about the need for continuous learning, it's absolutely critical over the long term. This is going to be a sector that needs to continuously learn. And some of these roles haven't had to do that historically. So it's got to be baked in. Micro-credentials could be a solution, but we do need to agree on what it is. Is a micro-credential recognizing hours in class, or is it recognizing competence to perform in a specific function or in a specific competency? And so once we've all sort of agreed on that, I have my own feelings on it, of course, but once we've all agreed on that, then I think they could potentially be used, particularly in a more centralized way, rather than, an employer saying, here's my credential for this, or another employer saying, this is my micro-credential for that. We all have to sort of agree on what a micro-credential is.
Right. Yeah, I think sometimes it can seem a little daunting to get, if you don't have a technical background, to get into it. And I think there are ways, but you're right. I think we need some work in the industry. So, okay, so I'm just looking at the time, and we are getting a little short, unfortunately. There's so many questions left to answer. So if people didn't get their questions answered today, what's the best way to get a hold of EAD?
Yeah, so you can either send a message to myself. So I will put my email address in the chat, because I don't think I included it in the slide deck. So at ehrc.ca. So if anybody wants to get a hold of me that way, feel free. And if I can't answer it, I have a team member who will be able to. We've got a team of economists on our team that help to put this whole report together. I always joke that I'm the pretty face and they're the ones who do the real work. But we're happy to answer questions where possible. If it's a question related to our sector, for sure. For energy efficiency specifically, I may have to lean back on Allison a little bit, perhaps. But we're happy to work with you on whatever questions come up.
Fantastic. So I'm just looking at all the questions, and I think we could probably have our question and answer period last for another hour. Honestly, there's some really great questions in here. But again, just trying to get people back into their day. I'll sort of ask one final question. So if you were to leave here today, leaving one message with our audience, what would that message be?
If we're serious about getting to net zero, it is going to be an all hands on deck approach. So it is going to be improving building envelope, so energy efficiency. It is going to be build out across generation types. It is going to be build out of transmission infrastructure, and it's going to be build out of distribution infrastructure. And no one solution is going to solve the problem. We have to do it all, which means big investments in training, upskilling, and onboarding and retaining workforce. That's the only way we get there.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, well, with that, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. I know there's a really big mix of people in the audience, people that are looking to get into the sector, people looking to help kids get into the sector. So it sounds like if you're looking for that map, you can contact Mark, contact EHRC, people, interested in electrification, how the sector is responding. So lots of great questions, lots of diversity in our audience today. So thank you so much for joining us. If you're interested in learning more about the life of a retrofitter, our next discovery session in 2 weeks is actually going to be skills and abilities and sort of pathways when it comes to retrofitting in Canada. So please join us for that. It's not on the website quite yet. We should have it up in a day or two. Look forward to that. And finally, just thank you so much, Mark, for joining us today. That was unbelievably informative. Again, I think we could probably talk for another hour, but thank you so much for your time and all the information you shared with us today.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone for being on the call today. Really appreciated the opportunity to speak with you and be in touch.
Okay, wonderful. Happy Friday, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.